So in this video, we are going to look at some practical example of how to use Docker in a local development process. So the prerequisites before you get started with this video is you have to understand some basic concepts of Docker and you have to know some of the basic commands. So if you don't, you can check out my videos where I cover both the concepts and the commands, and then you can come back to this video. So what we're going to do is a simple demo of a JavaScript and Nodejs application in the backend to simulate the local development process, and then we're going to connect it to a Docker container with a MongoDB database in it. So let's get started. So in this video, we're going to see how to work with Docker containers when developing applications. So the first step will be we're going to develop a very simple UI backend application using JavaScript, very simple HTML structure and a Node.js in the backend. And in order to integrate all of this in the database, we are going to use a Docker container of a MongoDB database, and also to make working with the MongoDB much easier so we don't have to execute commands in the terminal, we're going to deploy a Docker container of a Mongo UI, which is called the Mongo Express, where we can see the database structure and all the updates that our application is making in the database. So this development setup should give you an idea of how Docker containers are actually used in the development process. So I've already prepared some very simple JavaScript application. So in order to see the code, basically we have this index.html that is very simple code, and we have some JavaScript here, and we're using Node.js backend that just serves that index.html file and listens on port 3000. So we have the server running here in the backend, and we have the UI that looks like this. So basically it's just the user profile page with some user information, and user can edit their profile. So if I, for example, change the name here, and if I change the email address and do changes like this, I can save my profile and I have my updates here. However, if I refresh the page, of course the changes will be lost because it's just JavaScript Node.js. So there is no persistent component in this application. So in order to have that, which is actually how real life applications work, you'll know that you need to integrate the application with a database. So using that example, I will try to showcase you how you can actually use the Docker containers to make the development process easier by just pulling one of the databases and attaching it or connecting it to the application. So in this case, we're going to go with the MongoDB application. And in addition to MongoDB container, we're going to also deploy a MongoDB UI, which is its own container. It's called Mongo Express, where we can manage or see the database insights and updates from our application much easier. So now let's see how that all works. So in order to get started, let's go to Docker Hub and find our MongoDB image. So here, let's go to Mongo, and we have MongoDB here. Actually, and the Mongo Express, which is another Docker container that we're going to use for the UI. So first, let's pull the MongoDB official image. So I already have MongoDB latest, so pulling doesn't take longer on my laptop, but you're gonna need a couple of seconds probably. And the next one we're gonna pull is the Docker Express, which I also have, I believe. So let's see. Yes, it's also fast. So if I check locally, I have MongoDB and Mongo Express images. So the next step is to run both Mongo and Mongo Express containers in order to make the MongoDB database available for our application, and also to connect the Mongo Express with the Mongo DB container. So let's do the connection between those two first. In order to do that, we have to understand another Docker concept, Docker network. So how it works is that Docker creates its isolated Docker network where the containers are running in. So when I deploy two containers in the same Docker network, in this case Mongo and Mongo Express, they can talk to each other using just the container name, without localhost, port number, etc., just the container name, because they're in the same network. And the applications that run outside of Docker, like our Node.js, which just runs from Node server, is going to connect to them from outside or from the host using localhost and the port number. So later, when we package our application into its own Docker image, what we're going to have is, again, a Docker network with MongoDB container, Mongo Express container, and we're going to have a Node.js application which we wrote, including the index.html and JavaScript for Frontend in its own Docker container, and it's going to connect to the MongoDB. And the browser, which is running on the host but outside the Docker network, is going to connect to our JavaScript application, again using hostname and the port number. So Docker by default already provides some networks. So if we say Docker network ls, we can already see these auto-generated Docker networks. So we have 4 of them with different names and the drivers. We're not going to go into details here, but what we're going to do is create its own network for the MongoDB and the Mongo Express, and we're going to call it Mongo Network. So let's do this right away. I'm going to say Docker network create, and we are going to call it Mongo Network. So now if I do Docker network ls again, I see my Docker network has been created. So now in order to make our MongoDB container and the Mongo Express container run in this Mongo network, we have to provide this network option when we run the container in the Docker run command. So let's start with the Mongo. So we all know that Docker run is the command to start a container from an image, right? So we have Docker run Mongo, which is the basic Docker run command. However, in this case, we want to specify a couple of things. As you learned from the previous videos, you have to specify something called port. So we need to open a port of MongoDB. The default port of MongoDB is 27017. So we'll take that port actually for both host and container. So Mongo will run at this port inside of a container, and we open the same port on the host. So that will take care of the port. Then we will run it in a detach mode. In addition to that, there are a couple of things that we can specify when starting up the container. And these are environmental variables of the MongoDB. Let's see, in the official image description, you actually have a couple of documentation about how to use the image, which is very helpful to kind of understand what kind of configuration you can apply to it. Here you see some environmental variables. So basically on startup, you can define what the root username and the password will be, which is very handy because we're going to need those two for the Express to connect to the Mongo. And you can also specify the init database. We're just going to provide the username and password because we can create the database from the Mongo Express UI later. So let's do that. And the way you can specify the environmental variables, you can actually see here as well, is by just, let's copy this one. So here you say environmental variable, that's what the -e flag stands for. And root username, we'll say it's admin, and another variable, which is the password, will be just password. So in this way, we can actually override what the default username and password will be. So 2 more things that we need to configure in this command are container name, because we're gonna need that container name to connect with the Mongo Express. So we'll call this one MongoDB, let's say. And another one we need is the network that we created, which was called Mongo Network. So in order to make this command a little bit more structured, do it on multiple lines. So let's see. So it's more readable. So basically all these options or all these flags that we set, to go one more time through them, it's going to start in detached mode. We are opening the port on the host, username and password that we want MongoDB to use in the startup process. We're going to rewrite or overwrite the name of the container, and this container is going to run in a Mongo network. And this should actually start the container. Okay, so if you want to see whether it was successful, we can log the container and see what's happening inside. So as we see, Mongo was started and everything actually looks good. Waiting for connections on port 27017. Okay, so now let's start Mongo Express. We want Mongo Express to connect to the running MongoDB container on startup. And here we have an example of how to run it. And here we have the list of environmental variables that we can configure. So let's quickly look at them. Username, password, we don't need them. However, we need the admin username and admin password of the MongoDB. This is actually what we overrode with admin and password. So we're gonna use them because Express will need some username password to authenticate with the MongoDB and to connect it. The port is by default the correct one, so we don't need to change that. And this is an important part. This is the MongoDB server, right? So basically this is the container name that Express will use to connect to the Docker. And because they are running in the same network, only because of that, this configuration will work. If I hadn't specified the network, then I could specify the correct name here of the container, but it wouldn't work. So with that said, let's actually create the Docker run command for Express as well. So let's clear the history and let's start. So again, we run it in a detached mode and let's see what parameters we need. So first of all, port, let's say what is the default port that the Express runs on. That's 8081. So we'll take that. So basically it's gonna run on our laptop on port 8081. The next option would be these two. And remember, environmental variables need to be specified with -e. And this is the username of MongoDB admin, which is admin, because we specified it when we started the MongoDB container. This is the password. Let's set this one as well. Don't forget the network, --net Mongo network. We have the name. We can also call it Mongo Express. And let's see what else we might need here. Yes, this is important one. And our container name, let's actually see it again. Docker PS, the one running. It's called MongoDB. That's the container name, and this is what we need to specify here. So I'm gonna write this here. And finally, the image is called Mongo Express. So I'm just gonna copy this one here, and that is it. So basically with these commands, Mongo Express should be able to connect to the MongoDB container. So let's run it, and just to make sure, let's log the container and see what's happening there. Waiting for MongoDB. Welcome to Mongo Express. It looks like it connected successfully. It says here, database connected. And the Mongo Express is available at port 8081. So let's check the Mongo Express out at the port 8081. So actually, let's close these tabs. We don't need them anymore. And here, if I say localhost 8081, I should be able to see the Mongo Express. So these are the databases that already exist by default in Mongo, or which are created on startup. And using the UI, we can create our own database. As we saw previously, we could have specified an environmental variable initDB on MongoDB startup, and that would have created a new database. However, it doesn't matter. We will just create a database name here. So we will call it user account database. So let's create one. And now we can actually use it or connect to this database from Node.js. So let's see how that works. So now we have the MongoDB container and the Mongo Express container running. So let's check that. We have both of them. We'll have to connect Node.js with the database. So the way to do it is usually to give a protocol of the database and the URI. And the URI for a MongoDB database would be localhost and the port that it's accessible at. So I already went ahead and prepared the code for Node.js. So basically we are going to use a Mongo client here, which is a Node module. And using that Mongo client, we are connecting to the MongoDB database. So this is the protocol, the host and the port that we just saw that the MongoDB is listening at, and username and password of the root user of MongoDB. Of course, usually you wouldn't put the password here or not use an admin or root username password to connect to a database, but this is for just the demonstration purposes. And these are username and password that we set as environmental variables when we created the Docker MongoDB container. So let's check that. So this is the MongoDB container command, and this is the username, root and root password that we specified, and this is what we are gonna use in the code. As I said, for demonstration purposes, I will write the password directly here. So then we connect to the database. So I also went ahead and in the Mongo Express user account database, and inside that I created a collection, which is like a table in MySQL world called users. So here I connect to a user account database and I query the collection users. And this is a GET request, so I'm just fetching something from the database, and this is update request, same thing. I connect to the database using the same URI and the database name, and I update or insert something in the collection. So now let's see how all that works. So let's head over to the UI. So in the users collection, there is no data, it's empty. So we're gonna refresh it and edit the data. So I'm gonna write here some and update it and refresh. We see that a new insert was made. So this is the update profile section here. So all this was executed, it connected to the MongoDB, and now we have one entry, which is email, coding, name that we changed. So if I'm gonna refresh it now, I fetched the newly inserted user data in the UI and I displayed it here. And also if you wanna see what the MongoDB container actually logs during this process, we can actually look at the logs. So I'm gonna say docker ps and log using the container ID. So let's say if I wanted to see just the last part of it because I want to see what the last activity was, I can also, let's clear this, and I can also do tail, so I can just display the last part of it. Or if I wanted, I could also stream the logs. So I'll clear this again, and I'll say stream the logs. So I won't have to do Docker logs all the time. So if I make a line here, for example, to mark the last logs, I can refresh it. Let's make some other changes. Let's change it to Jones and save profile. So I'm gonna see some activity here as well. So these connections are new, and it also says received client metadata, and this is where the Node.js request comes in with the Node.js and its version. And at the end of each communication, there is an end connection because we end the database connection at the end. So we see that also in the logs. So if, for example, something wasn't working properly, you could always check them in the logs here. So with that, I have a fully functional JavaScript Node.js application which has a persistence in the MongoDB database, and we also have Mongo UI, both of them running in a Docker container. So this would be somehow a realistic example of how local development using Docker containers would look like. Thanks for watching the video. I hope it was helpful, and if it was, don't forget to like it. This is a video series, so I will create a new one every week. So if you want to be notified whenever a new video comes out, then subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions, if something wasn't clear in the video, please post them in the comment section below and I will try to answer them. So thank you and see you in the next video.